Welcome everyone to February 2021's Citizens Climate Lobby Canada education call. Before I start, I just wanted to introduce Florence to all these amazing volunteers. They're literally from coast to coast right now. And I know this will infuse into our organization because they are so good at cross-communicating and carrying messages forward. And they've just done an exceptional job over the past decade, just bringing beautiful evidence-based information to the communities. Now I would like to introduce you all to Florence. Florence is from the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. You may have heard it referred to as CPAWS. And Florence has been the National Director of CPAWS Forest Program since 2014. Her CPAWS work focuses on the Species at Risk Act, climate change policy, and forest management standards. And we all know everything is connected, so she's right in our wheelhouse. She has a master's degree from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Relations and International Environmental Issues, and has been working on international and national forest and climate policy questions since 2006. Before joining CPAWS, Florence produced key inputs for the Western Climate Initiative, the California Climate Action Registry, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and the Canadian government on forest carbon programs. Florence has also managed a project working with 9 NGO partners in Brazil, Indonesia, and Cameroon, where she worked with them in designing and implementing programs aimed at reducing deforestation and forest degradation, as well as improving forest governance and indigenous people's rights in each country. So Florence, very happy to have you here tonight. I'm going to let you take the floor now.
Thank you so much. And really thanks to everyone for being willing to sit through an evening of presentation, but I really actually hope that the presentation part will be short and then we can have lots of questions. I wasn't 100% sure what everyone's starting point on this topic was, so feel free to stop me if you have questions. I'm like sometimes somewhat of a nightmare with acronyms, so I will try not to use any acronyms, but if I do, feel free to stick your hand up or yell out or something. I did send a presentation, but I'm thinking maybe I should share my screen, or does that make sense for folks? I'm gonna do, okay, host has enabled sharing, hopefully, yep, here we go. So we'll do this and put it into presentation mode. Hopefully, okay, can folks see that? Awesome, thank you. So working at the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society and my previous job, which was really focused on climate policy and climate change policy, one of the tasks that I gave myself when I first started working at CPAWS was to really figure out where could we start to intersect climate policy and biodiversity policy in order to have dual outcomes. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a paper that I produced in 2019 and some of the thinking behind it, and propose a potential solution, but I'm really interested in hearing people's thoughts about where you see it working or not working, and you're somewhat of a testing ground for me. So I will just get started. And so I thought I would put this great cartoon up that was created a couple of weeks ago, where I think he was trying to demonstrate that all of these things are really interrelated. Of course, there's the biodiversity collapse, which we're hearing a lot about. Obviously, climate change we're hearing a lot about, and those two things are really interlinked. Then there's the recession and economic concerns and people's well-being and our ability to live our lives. And then there's COVID-19 on top of all of that this year. And so I think the joke was he was just saying, be sure to wash your hands and all will be well. But really the waves that are coming towards us are quite significant. So we may have to do more than wash our hands, I suspect. And so in 2019, one of the things that I really wanted to highlight, and in my job, I mostly speak to the federal government in Canada, that's sort of my main audience, I guess, was to help them realize that the things that cause greenhouse gas emissions, the same actors that cause greenhouse gas emissions on the fossil fuel side, are often the same or very related to the folks that are causing greenhouse gas emissions from changing our land use. And that every time that we degrade our ecosystems, there's also a huge biodiversity cost. And so, you know, at the most basic of levels, the more that we can start to think about how to reduce our footprint on the land in a very literal way, we can start to reduce emissions and reduce our impact on biodiversity. And I was at a summit recently with some great indigenous folks who just called it lightening our footprint on the land. And for me, that really resonated because I think that this is kind of what we have to do. We have to figure out how to live more lightly on this planet. And it will have great consequence for multiple issues. And so from a climate perspective, because obviously with the federal government being very interested in climate policy, I was trying to explain to them that the greenhouse gas emissions that come from us degrading our ecosystems are quite significant. And when you're thinking of it from a policy perspective, and you're looking at the seismic lines, for example, and the winter roads and the impacts that that has on methane emissions due to the change in hydrology and peatlands, you're looking at a lot of cars that you would need to take off the road, for example. So from a policy perspective, you know, trying to help them see how dealing with our land use emissions is the same as dealing with some of our biggest problems from an emissions perspective on the fossil fuel side. I won't go through these numbers, but I think there's a PDF of the presentation and you're happy to have a look at them. And so another piece that has that I kind of wanted to highlight for the federal government was that, you know, in the debates around climate change to date, a lot of times when you talk about land use and land use change and emissions from land use change, things have a tendency from a policy perspective to be looked at as offsets. So a lot of times people will be like, oh yeah, we're going to have offsets from planting trees against our fossil fuel emissions. And for me, I just think that that is insufficient. The reason for that being that, you know, the scale of our problem is so big that I just generally don't love the idea of offsets. I mean, I think they can have their role. It's a pretty minimal role from my perspective in terms of dealing with either of these issues. But I really wanted the federal government to think a little bit beyond that and think, okay, what could we do? How could we innovate in the policy space to start to deal with these emissions in a broader way? And I should point out that one of the challenges in talking to the federal government about this topic in the Canadian context is, of course, that a lot of land use decisions are made by provinces and territories, not the federal government. And so in a way, part of what I'm interested in looking at are what are the tools that the federal government has, but of course we have to talk about what can the provinces do because technically they have sort of more direct authority over land use. So that's an important sort of piece of the constitutional puzzle, which I'm sure you guys are aware of because it does come up in the carbon pricing discussions also. So I created a roadmap. I was trying to put things in simplest terms so that people can get on board. So one is I wanted Canada to, in their international commitments, say that they would increase the amount of emissions that they were hoping to reduce, but that they would think about nature-based climate solutions as part of that. So it's really an and, not an or, that we would be looking at for nature-based climate solutions, because climate change obviously is going to have a huge impact on our ecosystems. And so we can't afford to fail on the fossil fuel side. And we also can't afford to fail on the land use side. We need both. And we need to push ourselves further. So that was part of what I wanted them to do. Then create a fund, a nature-based climate solutions fund, in order to be able to start testing different approaches, thinking about the different things that we could do, trying to kind of bring your allies on board, because of course it's a relatively new topic about how can we reduce emissions from land use and land use change, you know, not at a high level, but at a sort of a nitty-gritty level. And so I thought maybe a fund would be a good way for us to start getting that conversation started with the actors involved. We need to do more work on some of the accounting rules, and so I wanted to talk about that. And then really starting to think about who are the major actors that are generating greenhouse gas emissions from land use and land use change, and could they be included in the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, for example, as one possible tool for starting to get a price on carbon from our degradation of ecosystems. So that was fun. And I would say that since 2019, the federal government has actually done a lot on nature-based climate solutions. So that's been great. They've been relatively enthusiastic, by all terms. So one is this question of funding. So they have created pots of money that have come out actually kind of in the past months around nature-based climate solutions. We can definitely have a debate about whether the planting trees is really a nature-based climate solution, but anyways, we can leave that aside. But certainly in terms of enhancing wetlands and peatlands and thinking about agricultural lands to increase carbon sequestration, that I think is a really promising program, and also around the agricultural fund. So that piece I think is a good sign that they're starting to think about it. They're also talking about developing offsets. Just can't seem to get away from offsets no matter how much I try. They've actually done some really interesting work looking at improving the quantification of ecosystem emissions in impact assessments. They're doing a strategic assessment of climate change and are really starting to dig into the ecosystem carbon component of it, which I thought was quite promising. It's sort of a mainstreaming of this idea in the decision-making process, which I think is hopeful. And then in the climate lens, I've been advocating very strongly that they start to think about the ecosystem emission component of that and the degradation of our ecosystems in it as a way of increasingly bringing a climate and nature lens to the table, not just a climate lens. But there's obviously still more to do. I won't bore you too much with the details, although I'm happy to answer questions. Obviously, there's still work to be done on quantifying our emissions from ecosystem degradation or activities that cause ecosystem degradation. It's still an element of science that we need to continue to advance. I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done on modeling the pathways for the future. And I'm sure many of you have had discussions about biofuels, or, can we use wood pellets, or, how much are we going to be increasing agricultural lands in order to generate fuels? Wood products may be something that has come across in terms of, well, if we used more wood products rather than cement, what would that look like? And I think this is one of the really hairy places where the accounting becomes quite complicated, and our outcomes could really depend, like the outcome on the landscape could really depend on how some of those modeling exercises end up looking. So that's a piece that I'm really concerned about in a really kind of wonky way. So then I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on this idea and also get people's feedback and thoughts, or just shocks of horror, if that's what it brings up for you, on expanding the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Act to include large, quote unquote, large emitters of ecosystem carbon. And so I put this handy diagram in from what they did in relation to the fossil fuel side. And I think to some extent it is, I suspect that if we do the math on the land emissions side, this diagram is not going to look terribly different, to be quite honest. But who is responsible for those emissions might be slightly different, because in many cases it's a province or a municipality that's developing roads, or that's that's allowing some of these activities to move forward. So this question of who are the big emitters, and what is the rate of degradation that they're driving, and with that, of course, the rate of emissions that's occurring, is going to be key. And then, I think obviously there's a lot of land use regulations, and so we would have to do our due diligence and review and see what's already on the books and make sure that we're not over complicating the regulatory landscape by adding a new regulation that may be very close to something that's already on the books. I'm thinking, for example, in Alberta, I know they have quite a number of wetland policies, for example. How do those things intersect? We would have to look at that. But I think in good sort of climate policy, emission reduction mode to start setting thresholds and sector targets, and starting to either add a price or cap and trade or some kind of system to drive that down, and to hopefully create an incentive for companies and or other actors who are having a large impact on the land to figure out how to do things with a lighter touch. This is my simplified vision of this. I see there might be a comment in the chat room. I'm gonna have a look. Could you comment on the Alberta map? Just because there's so many things going on there. I'm happy to comment a little bit more on the question of Alberta. I mean, I think when we look at the national inventory on the land use change side, one of the things that we're seeing is that the rate of deforestation, while decreasing overall in the country, has increased in the Alberta context, and it's very linked to tar sands development, quite honestly, and seismic lines and that kind of thing. So I think when you look at where there's a lot of fossil fuel emissions and large emitters, often the land use degradation is not far behind spatially. What is a seismic line? That's a great question. So seismic lines are actually, I have a great picture of it in a previous slide. I wonder if I can do this. See all these lines here? These are seismic lines, and basically they're exploration. So they're used to figure out where to do oil and gas exploration. Unfortunately, many seismic lines, and if you fly between Alberta and the Northwest Territories and you look out of the airplane, you will see this for miles and miles and miles and miles. This was once intact boreal forests with no other activities. And it's the trees don't grow back there because in many cases, these are peatlands. They've compressed the peatlands as they went through to do the seismic lines, and the trees don't come back. In many cases, this is 60 or 80 years old, and the trees just aren't coming back in those places. So it does have a permanent impact on the landscape. I suspect I was near the end here. Well, in fact, I was. That's my last slide. I'll stop sharing. And happy to take questions or discussions or thoughts.
Yeah, I was fine until the seismic lines. That was shock and horror. Okay, I had no clue that existed, and yeah, thanks for that. I'd like to get the discussion going, and then I'm going to pass it over to everybody. So we have colleagues in Sweden, and they price carbon in Sweden, and very well, actually. And one of their worries is that by ramping up a price on fossil fuels and not doing the same on biofuels, we're actually risking our having wood pellets made and taking down our forests. And so I just wondered if you wanted to comment, like, is there accounting there? Should we start putting a price on biofuels and making sure it's measured? Like, any sort of sense on what they're thinking, because it's all new.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really legitimate concern, which is that if you put a price on fossil fuel emissions, but you consider that burning a tree is not causing an emission because you are just not counting it. You are counting it technically in your national inventory, but if you don't put a price on it from a person who's trying to deal with regulations, it's like it's not being counted, right? It's like, oh, who cares? It makes no difference. And so I think there are real concerns that you're just driving one set of emissions to another. And there's been a lot of really great modeling showing that, unfortunately, oftentimes burning wood products, for example, or using wood for energy is much, much less efficient. So not only are you having a land use impact, you're actually going to ultimately have more emissions because you're not burning an efficient fuel. There are of course, always technologies to try to make things better. You know, every caveat in the world probably exists around all of these statements, but it's definitely a concern and one that a lot of people are thinking. And I think at the heart of the problem is a lot of times people think, oh, I cut down a tree, but it's okay because it's going to grow back. And what they don't think about is when you cut down that tree, it could take, in Canada, it takes that tree 60 to 80 years, if not more, before it's fully stored the carbon that it had before it was cut down. Not to mention what you're looking at in terms of emissions from the soil. And again, if you compact the soil, it may never sequester as well as it did before, et cetera, et cetera. And so you just run into a lot of these challenges where there's a temporal issue where it's like, oh, wood should be great, but it really depends on how it's done and what the impact is. Oh, sorry, I see another great question. The Oxford food study, 79% animal agriculture, right? Yeah, yes, it's, you know, I think part of the challenge, I just read this really great paper where they were looking at, should we intensify our agricultural production or should we have it more dispersed across the land but less intensive? And they found that the real challenge at the end of the day is we need to reduce demand, you know, and this is a really hard discussion, I think. And, you know, I think it's amazing that it's happening in the fossil fuel space, but it also needs to happen on the land space, which is that if we continue to demand more and more wood products, for example, even if that wood product is better than the cement product, we don't have an endless amount of wood either, right? So, and it's the same with the food question, is that if you don't start thinking about dealing with food waste and, you know, cleaning up our food system so that we don't have to use as much land for agriculture and people can still eat, right? Because obviously that's key. We're not kind of going to get to this. We're not going to get to an answer. And so trying to think about that whole scale of issues from consumption to, you know, to the actual land is, I think, one of the big challenges for creating reasonable policies and making sure there aren't crazy holes.
So are you saying you would support a more plant-rich diet?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in general, it has shown that plant-rich diets are, you know, less GHG intensive. It's not an area that I study in great detail, so I would definitely want to, you know, read more papers and make sure of that. But I can definitely see where that's probably true and makes a lot of sense for us to start thinking about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that Oxford food study kind of changed my life. Like I've
Yeah.
been, you know,
Yeah.
it convinced me. The Joseph Poor, after 1 year of the 5-year studies, decide to go vegan. It's quite compelling, the argument.
Yeah, and it goes back to that question of how do we lighten our footprint on the land, right? And I don't
Yeah.
fundamentally think that eating meat is the wrong thing in all cases, but it's also a question of like do we need to eat meat twice a day or 3 times a day in some people's, you know?
Right.
You know, do we need to eat so much meat 3 times a day? You know,
Yeah.
And I, you know, everybody has different values, and I'm not trying to say that people have the wrong values, but I do think that when you're thinking about it in terms of your footprint on the land, as a huge population of people that's continuing to increase, you know, how do we do that? I mean, I think even thinking about population, again, not a super easy conversation to have, but if our populations continue to grow and our expectations that we're going to be eating well and 3 times a day and, you know, meat all 3 times, and we're really putting a big strain on our planet. This is not
like I'd like to see, I guess, meat, you know, sort of be priced appropriately for the damage it causes. That would be a huge step. Like right now it's subsidized and it should probably be taxed.
Yeah. Well, I think food waste is another thing that just breaks my heart. I just, you know, again, this is not my area of policy expertise per se, like I don't, but just as a person, I'm sort of personally devastated by the food waste issue. I see another question about the 1 billion trees for planting trees. I'm happy to tackle that. So I think the tree planting question is complex because in Canada, I think that the drive to plant trees in Canada came from a good place, in the sense that internationally planting trees makes a lot of sense in a country where you have significant degradation and no forests, intact forests remaining. Then, you know, all you have left to do is restore. So of course, in those places, planting trees and maintaining and restoring those ecosystems is vital. The Canadian situation is somewhat different because we still have some amazing forests, although you just saw the seismic lines. We still have some amazing forests. And from my perspective, from a climate perspective, protecting the existing forest would be my priority towards restoring. Having said that, our southern forests have been extremely damaged, and certainly a much larger human footprint in our southern forests than the northern forests. And in some cases, I think those forests are vital for, especially for adaptation concerns, even if from a mitigation perspective, I think the question is a little bit more complex. So the importance of really thinking about the Billion Tree Program from a human wellness perspective and the adaptation lens, as well as potentially mitigation and biodiversity, because it's certainly important connectivity aspects. I'm hoping that they are going to get that right and that will make those trees be very valuable. One of the concerns we've had at CPAWS is making sure that those trees get planted and then are not just cut by the forestry industry in 60 years or 70 years to make harvested wood products. We would like those trees to stick around for a lot longer if possible. So that, I think, is going to be a battle, and actually really demonstrates the challenge with that kind of policy action, because which one of us is going to be around in 80 years to make sure that those trees are still standing, or that we have an increase in net trees overall in Canada. So difficult. Hopefully that made sense.
Maybe one more question and then we can
Sure.
start wrapping it up. Is that okay?
Yes.
Because this is wonderful. This is like total, thank you.
Of course. So I'm sort of seeing two questions around logging. And sorry. Yeah, so I think forestry is one of the challenging spaces for us in Canada, in part because our ecosystem has some natural regeneration. So especially in the boreal where you have fires, it's kind of normal for the ecosystem to, it's not like the coastal forests of BC where those trees stand for, 500 or more years, storing that carbon forever. In the boreal, you have a system where in some cases you've got trees burning, every 100 years, in some cases every 200 years. And so when they're doing the math around, well, what if we just cut those trees and put it into harvested wood products that could maybe hang out a little bit longer, that's where some of these questions about, well, are wood products good or bad, start to get a little bit more complicated. But without getting too much in the nitty gritty, my perspective on this is that we have a tendency to overemphasize what I call the substitution benefits of wood. And so we believe that if we just have wood products, they're going to make less cement and that's going to reduce emissions, and won't it be great? But I suspect that we're underestimating the increase in demand for things, which may mean that we will not see an emission reduction at all. Maybe it'll be a slightly slower rise. But again, it comes back to how do we change fundamentally our thinking about our footprint, rather than thinking that we can tweak in the margins and just switch a few things from cement to wood and have it all be okay. I think that's a very dangerous line of thinking, and one that's not going to get us very far in dealing with both the biodiversity and the climate issues. Not sure I fully answered that question, but I might have to digest it more.
Well, first of all, this was excellent. This has begun a discussion, and I hope you're going to come back and join us again, because this is an avenue I don't think we've ever explored as an organization. And I'm half Italian, and we have a really hard time saying goodbye. especially when we're enjoying a conversation. So the audience here is going to have to turn on their microphones and say thank you and goodbye to Florence, because I don't want to say goodbye. I am enjoying this immensely. So please, everybody, say thank you, and we hope you come back, because this is just an awesome conversation starter. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you.
please reach out if you have additional questions.
Thanks, Florence. Good night.
Thank you.
Good
Presentation.
Bye, Florence.
Good night.
Ciao.
Thank you.
That's it. It's over. Okay.